some of you know, a lot of the work I do is on business and peace. I tend to focus more on larger national firms in areas of conflict and crisis, and also SMEs. But I also try to look at some of the macro trends that we see, and one of them is really how businesses from the U.S. and Europe, especially multinationals, have really started to embrace this notion of CSR through ESG, through sustainability, and through the business and human rights agenda. And we've seen them do all sorts of things that they would never have done 20 years ago. That said, one of the foundational components of peace and conflict resolution is the establishment and the promotion and the support to democracy. And this is something that companies really don't like to talk about. And this is one of the big questions that I've kind of had over the last a year or so, I would say, is, okay, if they're talking about human rights, they're talking about civil liberties, they're talking about everything, democracy is the umbrella or the cascading framework from which all of these, rights tend to flow. And so first of all, why aren't companies talking about democracy? And second, is there anything that we can do to help raise this agenda in a productive way, either for policy or for the businesses themselves or for scholarship? Now, of course, I'll start by saying, we all know why businesses aren't talking about democracy, especially the big multinationals, because they, many of them are afraid they'll get blackballed from doing business in a third of the world. Or maybe it'll make their supply chains or their joint ventureships, doing impossible. Or worst of all, perhaps, if they tone down their arguments to the point where that's not a threat, then they'll look like hypocrites back home. So it's really this third rail for businesses. They're so afraid of shutting themselves out of these markets that perhaps this is why they don't talk about it. So so let's see if we can figure out a way to deal with it. Now, like I said, this has really been like kind of the elephant in the room since the start of the business and peace agenda, because we're happy to talk about issues of human rights and developing societies and how businesses can help. But we really don't talk about their role and responsibilities in the foundational principles of democracy. But one of the interesting things that John talked a little bit about and that we've written about is that, when Russia invaded Ukraine, companies not only were coerced or encouraged to honor the sanctions, many of them actually went farther. They went farther on their own accord in a very public way that we really hadn't seen before. So that was another question that got me thinking, is this something that's actually new? Is the interest in democracy a foundational principle? Why companies are supporting Ukraine? Or is this, as John mentioned, is this just kind of a one-off outlier that's going to morph us back to business as usual? And then the other question that I really want to bring to everyone here is, how can we leverage these feelings of positive contribution to get companies to be less terrified of supporting the thing that nearly everyone in the C-suite personally supports, but they're very afraid to have the company itself project that support. Okay, so I'm going to start with some data that I found and been working with for the last month or so. That is, it's really depressing. There is so I went through Edgar and the SEC filings, and this is a United States focus, but it's also relatively the same on the EU side. So I went through 10 years of data on quarterly and annual corporate filings, of which the sample is about 83,000. Of those, only 315 even mention the word democracy. And of that, most of them are, the real estate investment trusts that own Democracy Plaza buildings, or firms talking about the Cuban Democracy Act, or activities in CEO bios, that's the Democracy Fund, or my favorite, which was the GAP's use of democracy, which is their core belief is in the democracy of style. This is how businesses are currently talking about democracy. And then, so once we get rid of all those false positives, we find that over nearly 1 million pages of corporate activities and responsibility discussions and filings, the term is only used 24 times. And here it's mostly mining firms and media companies. The best example I could find was McClatchy, the media firm in the US, saying that we believe independent journalism is in the public interest. It's critical to democracy, and it's the underpinning of our success as business. This is great. And it made me really surprised. Like, why aren't more companies talking about democracy in those exact terms? What I found instead was these, I would say more nefariously, companies like Palantir and some of the tech firms that don't really believe in democracy that much, saying it is our mission to support Western liberal democracy and its allies. And for Peter Thiel to say this, it's very similar to like Exxon talking about climate change or Philip Morris talking about lung health. It's not it's not the sort of company that has actually a foundational interest in democracy aside from the business component of it.
Sorry, Jason, what is Palantir?
It's Peter Thiel's company that is I don't know, how would you describe Palantir?
An investment firm?
Yeah, it's like it's a quasi investment firm that also does a lot of work with governments. It's
think tank.
Yeah, it's intentionally vague about what they do.
Yeah, it sounds
They have a lot of money to support certain types of companies at certain types of places.
right. That's what I.
Type of agenda.
But it's publicly listed. It's on EDGAR filings. It's a
Yeah.
private sector. Yeah, it's not an NGO or
No.
no. These are all.
Okay, so the next question I had, which maybe some of you have as well, is like, okay, well, you're only looking at financial reports. It's not really capturing what the firms are doing. And I'm like, okay, that's probably right. But then I started searching other terms. Human rights had over 10,000 matches, and I wasn't quite sure how many of the 83,000 it actually hit, because once you hit 10,000 in the search engine, that's the limit. Same thing, of course, with CSR. That was probably more expected. But even like notions of civil liberties discussions were returning almost 10 times the matches. And it really showed that, businesses of all types across all sectors, they're all increasingly talking about social impact in their annual reports and filings. But democracy is really this one word that they will not touch. Now, one of the interesting things is like, this is medium and larger size companies. This isn't, it's not like every one of these companies wants to work with Saudi Arabia. But the way that firms are still not talking about democracy, especially over the last 4 years, when the threat to democracy, especially in the United States, is greater than at any time since 1865, it really puzzles me why they don't talk about it, even as they aggressively take stands on so many other issues that democracy encompasses. So in short, I would say companies want democracy and the leaders of companies want it, but they really want someone else to take that lead. Now, here's a couple of really interesting figures from a Morning Consult survey earlier this year, is that 83% of business leaders believe American companies should have a role in upholding democracy, which is kind of what you would expect. But 85% say capitalism itself depends on a well-functioning democracy. So this is something where business leaders recognize the value and importance of democracy. But I think that they're just hoping, like we also find in the business and peace space more generally, they want someone else to take the lead. And I think there's one really good example of this, and I put this little, make this a little bit smaller. Yeah, there we go. This was a little bit unfair and a little bit harsh, but there's this new initiative, a think tank in DC called the Business and Democracy Initiative, which is great. I think it's a great idea, and there are very few of these sorts of initiatives that are out there. But they've been trying to build this network with business for over a year, and not a single Russell 2000 firm has even signed up to it. So it's such a challenge to get businesses to even get into this discussion in a more associative way. So I really want to, take this to everyone here, but also talk a little bit more about why that's the case, and how we can galvanize business a little bit more in this issue, and also help companies feel less afraid to take that first step and to make them look less hypocritical. And one of the ways that we can do that is possibly through corporate diplomacy, where governments all over the world also deal with democracies and not democracies. They have their own personal agendas and their own personal preferences, but they're not necessarily seen as hypocrites in those discussions. So I'm actually going to go very, very quickly through the Ukraine case because John already went much more in detail, and of course we all know it very well. But Ukraine really was a test of the desires of many different types of companies in their relationship between democracy, invasion, and some of these big geopolitical events. So now, most firms that left Russia, when they did, they put out press releases that specifically, either implicitly or explicitly, talked about democracy, talked about the anti-authoritarian nature, what they're supporting, how they refuse to support these sorts of invasions. It was really an unprecedented event for multinational firms. So especially these large MNCs, they are starting to act and talk like diplomatic actors, not just aligning with or aligning with coercion, but really some of them are starting to take more proactive stances. And this is really grounded in their relationship to business and society, business and human rights that's coming up from within companies. But if we consider democracy the cornerstone of a lot of the business and human rights principles, and those of the social component of environmental, social, and governance debates, how can we get firms to be a bit more vocal about this? And I think that this really comes from the fact that if we really want businesses to lead, if we say they can lead, then they need to actually lead on the things that matter, as opposed to puttering around at the margins with generic statements about how human rights are good without defining what the rights are, and similar. So I think the one thing that's really important here is to look at the historical context. A lot of the democracy promotion hesitation, I think, comes from the experiences in the 1990s. So we start with, of course, the fall of the Cold War, glasnost, perestroika, which led into the good times with Clinton and Yeltsin and everything's opening. But it, of course, also triggered this domino effect around the world, where you started having all sorts of new resource conflicts, civil wars that were triggered by this massive global upheaval. And we can look here at this quote, which comes from Brookings in 1992, talking about the new Clinton administration, saying that 3 major challenges face this new administration: expanding the definition of human rights to bring non-Western nations into the tent, reconciling accountability for human rights abuses with national stability and sovereignty, and encouraging greater openness in non-democratic societies. On one level, this is great. On another, it's really depressing to read that this was 30 years ago, and we've made very little progress in any of these 3 challenges since then. Of course, there's not any point in sugarcoating either, because this is hard, perpetual work. This is the foundational principles of peace building. So I haven't actually found great data yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if businesses actually talked more about democracy in 1992 than they do today, because of that openness and that positivity, and the notion that they could support it in a way that was, perhaps they were less afraid. So, we, of course, know the reasons why democracy building fell off the agenda. It's really hard work. There were a lot of failures in the 1990s. And then really the Iraq War under the Bush administration really put the final nail in the coffin of the legitimacy of Western nations going in and saying that they can build democracy, and the whole purpose of why they're doing what they're doing. That said, there were some really strong keys of democracy building that I think are relevant for businesses if they would try to do something like this today. First and most important, I would say, is that coalitions and joint work, working with INGOs, working with IGOs, even working with governments, they're more successful in inducing lasting change than anyone who tries to go in alone themselves. Second, human rights and democracy in particular needed to be anchored within a basket of other issues, particularly economic issues, to not talk about democracy, but show how it mutually reinforces good business. Third, accountability needs to be balanced with sovereignty. This is something that is a huge challenge today, as well as, to what extent do you allow a regime to commit what you consider rights abuses without your own intervention? Now, of course, all societies prioritize different things, but the leaders of those societies, many would argue, don't have the right to couch their abuses in these excuses where, things work differently here. And then fourth, that democracy strengthening, and this is something that there's been a lot of empirical data for, it's the surest way to improve socioeconomic development on a national scale, particularly in a way that reduces those horizontal inequalities that John was talking about. And this is something that's really important and often gets lost in when people talk about democracy and get so focused on elections in particular. They lose some of the lessons that we have heard about why democracy actually matters for people, in addition to all the more typical Western notions of, democracy is good because of the representation and liberty that it provides, but it also is a much more effective long-term socioeconomic development path. And I would say, since we have so many people, especially working on Myanmar, one big idea that failed that is worth talking about is that economic openness on its own, liberalization on its own, does not make countries more likely to be democratic. Because what often happened in the 1990s, but also we see it with Myanmar now and a couple of other cases, is that when you liberalize haphazardly, it concentrates wealth in the exact people that you don't want the wealth concentrated in, which then makes democracy itself much more difficult to maintain and strengthen. So then the question becomes, okay, how do we convince companies to care about this? How do we convince them that's good business? How can we convince them it's worth the risk to talk about? I'm going to talk very briefly about a project that I started with Brian Ganson and Ann Jameson at Stellenbosch and Copenhagen Business School, which is looking at ways in which we can quantify business impacts upon society. And the first part of the project is a development of what we call the Business and Conflict Barometer. So this is taking a number of different data sets to get a representation of not only conflict, but also business activity, and most importantly, relationships between business, government, and society. So we're collecting millions and millions of observations, not by hand, of course, but we're using this data set called GDELT, which is a data set that takes basically every single media publication, and it codes it based upon not only like the actors, like particular ministers or individuals, but also organizations, sectors, and even the role that they play. And most importantly, it talks about whether these articles have a more positive or negative tone. So you can see over time if things become more positive or more negative about relationships between business and society, what then happens in the society. So the aim is then we're going to be matching it to the PRIO grid, which is a conflict database coded down to the square kilometer, to where we can see, is a really strong negative trend about business and government relationships predictive of where conflict is going to break out. This is primarily in Africa right now, but we will be expanding it, hope to expand it globally. So this is really the starting point of what we want to develop to try to bring a more quantitative empirical approach, because, over the last 10, 15 years of work on this, it is so much easier to talk to businesses when you have numbers to show them than it is to try to convince them through qualitative data. And I'm with you, John, like this is what I've been doing too. they just really warm up to it in a way that it's really hard to do with qualitative data alone. And this is actually kind of a bad slide. It's hard to read, but but this kind of gives you a very quick snapshot of the sorts of things that this tool can do, because it's a very, very powerful tool. And this is at the global level, but you can really get down to the square kilometer if you want to. So this is talking about sentiment at minds over time. The yellow, of course, is the good or neutral, and then the red is bad. I can't really zoom in or anything, but yeah, you can kind of see like the wealth of data that's available here is something that I think could be valuable not only for businesses themselves, but also peace and conflict researchers who can see how things change over time and what sorts of social consequences that could have. So we're starting to come up with data that will allow us to answer questions like, does business support for democracy improve democratic norms in these places? Does it make them more profitable? And perhaps most importantly, do positive relationships between business and local communities make local communities less likely to be interested in conflict or commit violence? These are big questions that a lot of us have anecdotal evidence on, but being able to find some sort of comparative links is something we're really excited about. So I'll just kind of wrap up a little bit here and talk about the S and ESG, just because ESG in particular is so attractive right now. It's gotten so much more attention, not only in a positive way, but also in a negative way. When you have, it's front page of The Economist talking about how we should get rid of the S because it's too hard. And we have Elon Musk, now of Twitter, who is, saying that it's all a scam, but what it does is it raises attention to it to the point where when you talk about ESG now, people actually know what you're talking about. It's a word that it's an acronym that people have heard of, and at the same time you have consulting firms like McKinsey, PwC. They are hiring tens of thousands of people in ESG every year because they expect that ESG investments are going to increase something like 10 times in the next 4 years. And it's already like over $1 trillion. So, I mean, this is the future of investing. But at the same time, the S itself is so poorly defined. It's so poorly empirically worked through that there's so many opportunities where I think that democracy can play a big role. For those of us who have read these ESG reports, I think I've read 30 different S and ESG reports. They all have a different definition of what the S is and what should be. It's a big mess, which I think is an opportunity for those in this space to work a little bit more to try to define this so that it doesn't just become the social or the conflict version of greenwashing or peace washing. But it is hard. I mean, it's much harder than the environmental side. So I just mentioned a few different pitfalls here, a few of which I've talked about already. The one I would really focus on, I think, is the forever horizon. It's on the environmental side, it's very easy to say, oh, we did this, it's 20% better now, we reduced this, we reduced that. It's impossible to make an argument to say, oh, we increased democracy by 10%. Therefore, you have to use different metrics, and you have to try to understand those relationships in a way that businesses find very hard to do. But I think it's worth the prioritization. I think it's worth talking about. But where I'm stumbling myself a bit is trying to figure out like what the pitch is to businesses, and that's something I'd love to kind of open up here at the end. So I'm going to end here with with me being bored this week and playing around with AI image generators because it's fun. So I put in business for peace as a term in the AI generator Midjourney, and this is what it came back with, which is great. Yeah, you have happy factories, happy life, some canals. It's wonderful. It's great. What I find very interesting about this is, of course, how Midjourney builds its interpretations in the first place. And it does this by effectively scraping the entirety of knowledge on the internet for the term itself. So what I take from this is it's a really positive perception of business for peace right now, and of the role of business in society. There are indications that the public perception, at least in the US and in Europe, of business itself is, perhaps more, it's not entirely positive, but it's more positive than it's been for maybe 100 years. And this is a really good opportunity to try to leverage that into constructive good. Because we all have many, many different examples of businesses failing and failing to live up to their expectations. But there is a groundswell, and I think it comes from businesses themselves as well, and the people who work for businesses, that they actually want to be more positive actors. Now, of course, we contrast that to, most of us in this event, most of us in this space, we tend to think more negatively about business. So for this one, I asked the AI to show me just like a hot take factory. And this is what it made. It's just a big disaster. And this is what we see when we think about what businesses do in society, because we tend to focus on the really hard places. Like John was saying, like we focus on the areas of the most acute crisis where failures are most likely to come from.
So what was the search term? You can read it here.
Oh yeah, a hot take factory.
What does it mean?
Like a hot take is an uninformed comment that someone makes about about politics, about society, about anything. So there's a lot of those floating around in the business and peace space too. Half of which have been promoted by me and John. Probably.
Yeah.
But I mean, when we talk about this notion of business for good, business for peace, S and ESG, I mean, this is a $1 trillion car that's careening down the freeway right now with no guidance, very little direction, and the C-suite that's behind the wheel is effectively a toddler who's never driven before. So we have I would say almost a responsibility to at least try to help them steer it a little bit so that we can avoid the worst disasters and, fingers crossed, hopefully be able to help businesses make a more positive, concrete role than they've done in the past. Because if not us, who will?